Well, good morning, everyone. For those of you I haven't had a chance to meet before, my name is Mike King, and as the senior pastor here at Suburban, I just have an incredible privilege of leading a wonderful group of lay leaders and volunteers and staff who make everything that we do here as a church possible. And there's just a lot going on. I'm grateful that Adam in our prayer time kind of updated you all on some of what's going on with Jamie and Brandy Mills and the church plant they're going to be launching in North Albany around January or February. It's got a name now, Northside Christian Church, and they've actually got all of their 501c3 papers incorporated with the state, so they are officially off and running. And we're going to do our very best over the next months as they're preparing for that to keep you all in the loop about what's going on there so that we can be praying with them and we can be praying for them in the work that we're doing. This morning, we're going to continue on. We're going to actually start a new series that we call God at the Movies. And each week, we're going to be looking at how the ideas in recent movies are not original to those movies themselves, but instead, they actually illustrate some of the truth of God as it is found in the Scriptures. And this morning, we're going to talk about the movie Wonder. And if you haven't seen it before, I really would encourage you to watch this movie. In fact, I would encourage you to watch this movie with someone so that then you can have a conversation with them about how the ideas in this movie point us back to the truth of the living God. That's part of the goal of this series, is to equip us all to know how we can better have faith conversations with people in the world around us who need to hear this life-changing message about God. And there's a lot of really great God ideas that you could pull out of this movie. But this morning, we're just going to drill down into one idea that illustrates something that Jesus taught 2,000 years ago when he was here on earth. And it's something that really transformed the way that people viewed each other and the way that people treated each other. And if we can figure out how to apply this lesson to our lives today, it really can make a difference for us as well. So to get started, I want to invite you to turn with me in the Bible to Luke chapter 7. If it would help for any reason, there are some red Bibles in those seats around you, and you're welcome to grab one of those and turn to the page number that's listed there on the screen so that we can be tracking along together. But the book that we're going to be reading from, we know it as the Gospel of Luke. Gospel is just a word, it's sort of a first century biography. So it's one of 4 ancient biographies of Jesus that we have recorded in the New Testament. And they're named for their author. So the author of this one was a man named Luke, who was a first century historian and a physician as well. But as you're turning there, let me kind of tag on, give you a little bit of an introduction to the movie that builds on the trailer that we watched. So the movie Wonder tells a story of a 10-year-old boy named Augie Pullman. And Augie was born with something like Treacher-Collins syndrome, which means that he had to have 27 surgeries to help him see and breathe and be able to eat and do all of that. But even after those surgeries, Augie doesn't look like a normal kid. And up until this point in his life, Augie's been homeschooled his whole life. But at the beginning of the 5th grade year, his parents make a decision that it's time for him to head to school. So the movie really tells the story about his experiences that first year and some of the lessons that he learns and the people in the life around him that they learn. And this movie is actually based on a book, which my wife and some of our older kids read aloud to each other. Now, I did not read the whole book out loud. I mean, I heard a little bit of it as they were reading it aloud. But when the movie came out, because they had all read the book, they decided to go see it. I decided not to go see it. Because even though I hadn't listened to the whole book, I'd listened to enough of it to know that in all likelihood, this is a movie that was going to make me cry. And I do not like to cry. I mean, really, it's about parents and the sacrifices they make for their kids and the challenges that kids have to face and how they can pull together and overcome them. I mean, if you've got 4 kids like I do, it's just a recipe to make you weep. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not interested in that. But over the course of the last year, enough people recommended this movie to me. People who are like, oh, if we do this God at the Movie series again, you have got to watch this movie. Jesus' fingerprints are just all over this thing. So I said, okay, well, I'll watch the movie. So I did, and it did, in fact, make me cry. In fact, it was on Amazon Prime. So at one point, I'm in the gym in our neighborhood, and I'm watching it while I'm running on the treadmill. Hey, have any of you ever tried to run and cry at the same time? It is ugly. I mean, it's just really not a good thing to do. But there I was kind of sobbing on the treadmill, you know, the buff guy over there lifting weights like, oh. But anyway, so. But if you think about it, it's one of those things. Actually, you know, going back to that, just so you know, if you watch this movie and you don't cry, I think that there's something really wrong with you. And that's okay. Take heart, because we know all sorts of wonderful Christian counselors and therapists that we can send you to, and they will get you straightened out. But really, it's one of those powerful, inspirational stories. And so I expected all of that when I watched the movie and it delivered. But it turns out the movie really surprised me in some ways too. Because while I was expecting the part of the story that was about Augie and how he overcame his trials, there was a lot of other layers to the movie that I just wasn't ready for. And it really kind of caught me off guard. And this morning, instead of talking about Augie, I want us instead to talk about one of these other things that's going on in the movie. I want us to look a little bit at his sister, Olivia. She's known as Via in the movie. And it turns out that she's got some struggles of her own as well. And one of the things that's really interesting about this movie is that different parts of the movie are sort of told through the lens, through the point of view of different characters. So at this point in the movie, I want you to watch a brief clip, and this is where we begin to hear a little bit from Via herself about her life. So it turns out that Via is dealing with her own challenges, right? She comes back to school after summer break, and she's got to deal with the fact that her once best friend Miranda is not even responding to her text messages. She's not talking to her. I got to be honest with you. When I first watched this movie and I got to this part and I saw how Miranda was treating Via, I didn't like Miranda very much. I was like, how dare you do that to my friend Via? I mean, really, like, you're your friend one year and not the next year. You talk to him one day, and not the next day. That is so unlike middle school and high school girls. No, of course it is, right? It's not just middle school and high school girls. Like, that's everybody, right? That's middle school and high school right there in a nutshell. And it's life in a big sense in a nutshell. We have to figure out, how do we respond to people when they hurt us? How are we going to respond to people when they don't do what we ask? And if you've ever been in a relationship like that, a relationship that has been strained, like, you know how hard it is to do the work of actually trying to love that person. So you see, when I watched this movie initially, I didn't like Miranda. But it turns out I didn't actually know everything about her that I needed to know. Like I said, one of the nice things about this movie is you get to hear people's points of view. And later on in the movie, we get to hear from Miranda herself about some of what's going on in her life. And when I learned that, I really began to see her differently. I began to understand her a little bit more. And it just reminds us of something, right? When we have a better chance to understand people, we know more about what's going on, it's easier to see where they're coming from. Now, I don't know if you all have ever had this experience before, but at least in my life, I found it is really easy to be mad at somebody from far away. But it's harder to do that up close. It's easy, really, to be angry and even to hate people from far away, but when you get to know them, it's just harder to do that up close. So there's a quote that gets mentioned near the end of this movie that's often attributed to Plato. Sometimes you see it attributed to other people. But it says this. It says, "Be kind, because everyone is fighting a hard battle." And that idea, that is very, very similar to the main point that Jesus is trying to make in the story that we are about to look at today in Luke chapter 7. And let me just go ahead and give you the big idea that Jesus is driving at. For him, the idea, he shows us in the story that when we better understand someone, we can understand how to love them better. Right? When we do the work, when his Spirit empowers us, when he helps us actually go and better understand someone, we can then do the work, we understand how to love them better. And here's the thing. If you're here this morning and you wouldn't consider yourself a follower of Jesus, you are not on the hook for anything that we are about to talk about today. Right? You are welcome to listen along and take notes. I would encourage you to try it out in your life, to give it a shot, because if you live these principles out, it will actually probably make you a kinder and more empathetic person. And we can probably all agree that the world could use more people like that. But if you're here this morning and you are a follower of Jesus, what we're about to talk about is not optional. Right? This is a command that Jesus Christ gave every single one of his followers. Jesus commands us to love one another. Actually, he says we need to love each other in the very same way that he has loved us. It's not an optional. It's not, if you think about it, you might want to consider loving one another. No, he says you have got to love each other. And in other passages, he really talks about who falls into that group of the other. And it's a pretty broad group for Jesus, right? We're supposed to love our friends, but we're supposed to love our enemies as well. Right? He calls us to bear one another's burdens and to care for each other. And what we're about to see in the story we're going to look at is that you can't really do the work of loving somebody if you don't see them, if you don't understand what's going on. I mean, if you think about it, if we're called to bear one another's burdens, I can't bear somebody else's burden if I don't know what the burden is. So Jesus commands us, you've got to love each other. But the way that we do that is by really doing the work to try to understand other people. Because when we better understand someone, we can understand how to love them better. When we better understand someone, we actually understand how to better fulfill the command that Jesus gives us. So let's take a look at this story and see how that plays out. We're going to start reading in verse 36 where it says this. It says, when one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. Now, the Pharisees were a group of religious leaders in the Jewish world of that day. And if you know anything about them from the biographies of Jesus, what you probably know about them is that Jesus and the Pharisees were always at odds. They were always butting heads. But at this point, it's fairly early on in the story, so there's not quite as much tension there. So one of the Pharisees invites Jesus to come to his house, and Jesus accepts. So he goes, and because it's a first century dinner, he reclines, which is a little different from how we eat dinner. But that's how you would eat dinner in the first century. You would recline on these couches. Your head would be near the table where the food is. Your feet are out behind you. So Jesus is there. He's accepted the invitation to the party. But things start to change pretty quickly. So in the next verse, it says, a woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair and kissed them and poured perfume on them. Now, is it just me? Does it seem strange to anybody else that this woman doesn't have a name? I mean, I'm sure that she actually has a name. The name's not just mentioned here. And if you read a lot of first century writings, you realize this is very, very common. It's reflective of the fact that women didn't have a very valuable place in that society. It was easy to leave them unnamed and pushed into the background and sort of just there on the margins. But that is not how Jesus treats women. So we're going to see in this story, Jesus values them. He sees them, and he invites them to be part of the story. But for whatever reason, we don't know the name of this woman in the story. The author doesn't include that, and maybe that's because of what he says about her. It says that she's a sinful woman. Right? This is somebody with a past. This is somebody that everybody in that small town probably knew exactly who she is and what she had done. A lot of scholars, when they look at this, they think, well, maybe this woman was a prostitute. So maybe it's just a little bit embarrassing that this woman has showed up at the party. But this idea about crashing, she's not like a wedding party crasher or something like that. It was actually fairly common in the first century for people who were poor or needy to show up at social gatherings like this, because they could hang out on the edges and they could expect that the scraps would go to them, the leftovers would go to them. It was a common practice, and it was part of how the Jewish people of that day really cared for the poor in her community. So the fact that she's there, I mean, apart from who she is, it's not too surprising that she's there. It's something you put up with. But it's what she does that really begins to throw a wrench into things for the host of the party. So she starts to begin to wash Jesus' feet. And again, that's just not something we see very often in our world, but it was a very common practice in the first century. My understanding is, sandals, there's no paved roads in the first century, right? So sandals plus dusty roads equals pretty nasty, dirty feet by the time you get to wherever you're going. So just a common part of the hospitality that a host would offer his guest is he would provide them an opportunity to wash their feet, so their feet could be clean as they enjoy that meal together. Well, the host hasn't done this for Jesus. But this woman, she's there, and she notices that this needs to be done, and she begins to do it. So cleaning somebody's feet, that's very common in the first century. But the way that this lady is doing it, by literally just weeping and using her tears to clean his feet and drying it off with her hair, that was weird even then. Okay, that's not how people typically got their feet washed then. And the fact that she's there and she's doing this thing in such an unusual way, that makes a scene. And the host of the party is not very excited about this. So here's kind of where he enters the story. It turns out he's a man named Simon. We'll learn that in just a minute. But it starts this way. It says, when the Pharisee who had invited Jesus saw this, he said to himself, well, if this man were a prophet, he would know who's touching him and what kind of woman she is. He'd know that she's a sinner. Jesus has got this reputation of being a prophet, and he's kind of scoffing under his breath like, yes, some prophet he is. If he was really a prophet, he'd know about this woman. He would know that this is not the kind of woman that you want touching your feet. And Jesus picks up on that, which, of course he is, because he's Jesus, right? Even if you're saying stuff to yourself, he's the Son of God. He's going to figure this out. He knows what the guy's thinking, and he calls him out on it. So this is what he says. He says, Simon, Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to tell you. Tell me, teacher, he said. And then he tells him a story. He says, 2 people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii, the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now, which of them will love him more? Just sort of as an FYI, a denarius was a coin that was worth about 1 day's wages. So if that kind of helps you figure out the amounts there. But the important thing to see is not the dollar amount. Right? Jesus wants you to see the relationship between the 2 debts. One debt is 10 times bigger than the other one. And Simon understands that. He can do the math. So when Jesus says, who does it more? Simon replies. He gets it right. He says, well, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. Ding, ding, ding. Jesus says, you have judged correctly. And then, and don't miss this, something really huge happens. It says, then Jesus turned toward the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? Now again, here Jesus is still talking to Simon, but he's turned his attention to the woman. And by doing that, he invites Simon to look at her as well. And he asks such an important question. He says, do you see her? Do you see her, Simon? It's like, yeah, I know you know that she's here. You made that crack about, well, if you knew the kind of woman she was, we know that you know she's physically present in the room. But this is a question that goes beyond that. He says, do you see her? Do you really see her? Do you understand why it is that she is doing what she's doing, that she is loving and honoring me in such an incredibly extravagant way? He says, do you see her? And that is such an important question for him to ask. Because it's true of human nature that Jesus knows. He knows that the way we see people has a big impact in how we treat people. Right? The way we see people will help determine how we treat people. And if we don't do the work to see people well, to really get to know them, to really know what's going on with them, it makes a difference in how we treat them. And there are all sorts of examples about how we see this play out in our lives, right? So just a couple of those, just out of curiosity. How many of you have ever been maybe running late to something and you're driving and you decide to drive a little bit more quickly than you normally would? Right, so you're driving down the road, and to do that, because you've got someplace to go, you might need to sort of change lanes aggressively, shall we say, to get around people. Well, if we're doing that, if we're the ones that are tearing down the highway like a bat out of hell, and we're cutting people off, in our minds we think, I have a good reason for doing this. Like, I need to get to the hospital, that person, I've got to visit them, I've got to get to the hospital, or there's this urgent situation at home that I've got to deal with. So when we think about our motivation for doing that, we realize that we're justified. But now, what is the first thought that comes into your mind when you get cut off on the highway? Is the first thought when you get cut off in your mind, oh my gosh, I bet that person has a family member in the hospital. I certainly hope they get there soon. Or do you stop, or do you think, you know what, I bet their kid just got back from summer camp and they're running home to give them a hug. Oh, I hope it's such a sweet reunion for them. No. If you don't know the person and they cut you off, in your mind, you think, that person is a jerk. Can't believe they're driving like that. Where are the cops when you need them, right? Or you think about being late. Has anybody ever been late to anything in their life? Okay, I'm occasionally late. So when I'm late, it's because I have a good reason. I was on my way out the door at the office, but there was just one last thing that we had to talk about, so I was a little bit late. But if I go to the doctor's office and she makes me wait for 20 minutes, it's because she doesn't care about her patients, right? She's just after money. That's why she overschedules people, right? And there's this tendency that we see in human nature when it comes to the person's motivation, to why they do what they do. We tend to fill in that blank, that motivation blank, about ourselves with what's best and about other people with what is worst, right? That's just how we do it. And we fill in the blanks, about worst with the other people. But do you know where that's not true? Do you know when we tend to not fill in the blanks about the motivation with what's worst about other people? When we know them, right? When we know them. So for example, if I've got a lunch appointment with somebody and they show up 30 minutes late, I might, kind of feel like, well, they don't value my time, they're being disrespectful. But if I've got a lunch appointment with my wife and she shows up 30 minutes late, I worry about her because I know her. And I know she's not rude. I know she's not disrespectful. I know she would be there on time unless there was really something going on, right? When you know the person, you view it differently. Just so example, I just finished writing this sermon and I had to go on campus for a meeting. So I'm coming down 15th Street. I'm getting ready to cross into Avery Park. And I have the right of way to go across, right? When you are turning left onto Highway 20 from Avery Park, you got to yield. So I'm getting ready to go, and somebody doesn't yield, and they just pull out in front of me. And my first thought is, what a jerk. And then you know what I realized? It was somebody from Suburban. And I saw him right there in the truck, and immediately I just kind of started laughing. Because I was like, oh, I know that person. And, they're not a bad person. They probably just weren't. And immediately I thought, oh my gosh, I'm doing exactly what I'm telling people in church on Sunday not to do. But that's how it is, right? If you do the work of seeing people, you treat them differently. Because how you see people, the work that you put into knowing them, it really does impact the way you treat them. And that is the point that Jesus is trying to make here. And to highlight that, he draws this contrast at the end of the story between Simon and the woman. He says this. He says, Simon, when I came into your house, you didn't give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You didn't give me a kiss, but this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You didn't put oil on my head. Simon, you didn't do any of the things that a host is supposed to do, but she's poured perfume on my feet. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven. Get this, as her great love has shown. Right? Her many sins have been forgiven as her great love has shown, but whoever has been forgiven little loves little. I mean, listen to that line. He says, obviously, this woman has many sins that have been forgiven because her great love is showing that. The actions that she is doing, the fact that she is doing this extravagant gesture for me, washing my feet in this way, she's doing that because her many sins have been forgiven. There's a reason why she is doing what she is doing. And Simon, if you looked beyond her actions to try to understand where she's been and where she's coming from and why she's doing this, you would understand better how to respond in this situation. If you did the work to better understand her, you would understand how to love her better and receive her better. That's what I've done. I know what's been going on in her life, which is why I'm treating her differently. And I think that Luke includes this story in his biography of Jesus for two reasons. One of which is that he wants us to see that our God, the God that we worship, that we follow, that he is a loving God and he is a forgiving God, right? This woman's many sins have been forgiven. He loves her. But I also think he includes it because he's trying to model for us the way that we are supposed to treat each other, right? This is how Jesus treated people, and that's how he calls us to treat other people as well, right? The reason for that's really simple. We are called to love as we have been loved. Right? That's the Christian life in a nutshell. Everything that we do is a response to what God has done for us. We love because he first loved us. We show grace and mercy to other people because he showed grace and mercy to us. We forgive other people because we have been forgiven of so many things. That's what Jesus is driving at here. Like, he knows it takes work to really try to better understand somebody. But he wants to motivate us to do that work because when we really understand people better, we understand better how to love them. And that's the Christian life in a nutshell. That's the ball game, loving other people. And Jesus says, I'm commanding you to love other people, but to do that well, you got to do the work to understand where they are. So let's go back to the movie for just a minute. I want you to see how things wrap up with Via and Miranda. I mentioned that kind of one of the unique things about the movie is you get to see these things from different perspectives. So this is a part later on in the movie where we get to hear a little bit more from Miranda about what's been going on with her. So I don't want to give everything away, but they reconcile at the end. Okay, just wanted you to have some peace about that. But here's the thing, when I was watching this part of the movie, like you get this and you understand what's going on in her life and her world with her parents and her family and just, I just wanted to say like, oh, Miranda, I'm so sorry that I was mad at you. You just want to give her a hug and be like, it's going to get better and we all make mistakes and that's what life is, but you pick yourself back up and Jesus can help you and your past doesn't determine what your future is. But that's really what this story illustrates. Right? It's just a dumb little clip from a movie. But it illustrates this incredible truth that Jesus wants us to know, that he wants us to live out in every relationship that we're in. The better we understand someone, the more we understand how to love them better. So what do we do with all of this? A couple of things come to mind. Maybe you're here this morning, and the person that you identify with the most in this story is that woman. You look at the mistakes that you've made. Maybe you're feeling far from God. Maybe you're here and you're like, I'm not even sure why they let me in the building today. In fact, I've got a friend who's been coming to Suburban some for the last few months. And when I was inviting them to come, they let me know they hadn't been in church in like 25 years. And initially when I invited them to come, they were like, well, I'm thinking about coming, but I'd hate for lightning to strike your building. And I tried to let them know. I said, the old part of the building, that roof is getting kind of old. So if we could get like a lightning strike, maybe that helps out with the insurance, get a new roof out of it. But here's the thing, eventually they ended up coming, and they've been coming every Sunday for a month. No lightning yet. And that's part of what I think you need to know. I mean, if you're here and you feel unworthy, you need to read this story and remember that what was true of that woman is true for you. God sees you, right? God sees you and God loves you. He knows everything you've done. He knows the past. There's nothing in your past that has burned a bridge that there's no way to come back across with him. He loves you still. And if you walk away from our time together today just knowing that, just taking that truth in and beginning to chew on that and think about how that can make a difference in your life, that can change the course of your life forever. But I know that others of us hearing the story and this realize that part of what it means to live out Jesus' command is to do the work to better understand people. If you're anything like me, there may be some people in our lives that we think about doing that to, and we really kind of push back against that. We just don't want to do that because I get that. Some part of it, you hear that and you're like, wait, you just want me to understand their story better so they can get like a free pass for everything they've done so we can just kind of sweep that under the rug like it doesn't matter? I don't think I want to do that. And in fact, you look at the story and say, well, at least the woman in the story apparently at some point said she was sorry and asked for forgiveness. That person in my life, they don't feel like they've done anything wrong. In fact, they're excited about the pain that they have given me. And so you hear this idea to really try to reach out to others, and it's just not something that you want to do. And here's what I think I'd want you to hear from the text today. I don't think that Jesus is saying that what other people have done to you is right. And I don't think that Jesus is saying that what you are feeling is necessarily wrong. It's just that what you're feeling may not be the healthiest way to move forward. You've got to remember that God's goal for you is the very same goal that he has for every single person. He wants every one of us to live the full, free life that we were created to live. And sometimes when we just hang on to things that we justifiably should feel, it just doesn't help us live that kind of life. It binds us up on the inside. But really addressing that, it can be hard. So if it's hard, take heart, because God's power is here to help us do this, to help us at least start moving in that direction. And again, that's not to justify what they've done or sweep it under the rug, but it can help us do the work to start to know them better so that we can figure out what does it look like, God, for us to love them better, since that's what you're calling us to do. So for some of us that are here today, maybe what we need to do to act on this is just identify somebody in our life that we need with God's power and help to begin to do the work of understanding them better. For some of us, maybe we know somebody who needs to hear this message. And what God is calling us to do today is to have a conversation with them about what we've talked about today. Right? Maybe you watch this movie with them and use that as a bridge into that conversation. Maybe you take them to Luke chapter 7 and walk through what we've talked about that today as a way to help them understand how this life-changing truth from Jesus really can free them up and can help them. That is part of the goal of this series. It's to help all of us be better equipped to just have one more tool in our tool belt to be able to have faith conversations with people that need to understand more about who Jesus is and the difference he can make in their lives. So here's what we're going to do. In just a second, to close out our time together, I'm going to pray. And I'm really just going to pray that God's power would come and help every single one of us know what it looks like to choose to follow the way of Jesus wherever we are in life. So with that in mind, would you pray to that end with me? God, thank you. Thank you for the truth that we find in your word. It's not always easy to think about it. I know personally, Lord, I like being on the side of being understood so that other people can love me better. It's harder to do the work to understand others so that I can love them better, and yet that is absolutely the best kind of work to do. It's what you've called us to do. It's what makes us better spouses in marriage. It's what makes us better parents and better children. It's what makes us better employees or bosses or coworkers or neighbors or friends. So God, I recognize in a room this size, a lot of us, we're in real different places in terms of how this story is hitting us. So I just pray that through the power of your Holy Spirit, you would help us find ourselves in the text today. Help us figure out where we are. Maybe we are in the place of this woman and we feel distant from you because of what we have done. God, would you help us remember that there is always a way back to you through your love and your grace and your power. Thank you for the example of that we see in this story. For others of us, God, maybe you're bringing to mind someone that we need to do the work of trying to understand them better so that we can figure out how to live out your command to love them better. And for others of us, God, you've put somebody in our mind and heart. We know that they're struggling with this. And this, the truth that we talked about today, this can make a difference for them. So God, would you give us the courage and help us know how to start a conversation with them that can point them back to your truth in Scripture, because that is what changes things. That is what changes us and is what can change our world. So we just pray, Lord, that you help each of us know what we need to do with what we've heard today, and that you would give us the courage to act on that. Amen.